The cameras are off, the politicians are gone, but the tents are still there. In the wealthiest nation on earth, over 2 million people were counted as homeless on a single night in 2024, an 18% increase over the previous year, and the largest single-year jump ever recorded. It is a crisis of staggering scale, with nearly 350,000 children among the unhoused, a 39% spike in family homelessness. Yet, the nation seems locked in a perpetual stalemate. We possess the data, the successful models, and the resources to solve it. So, why is the crisis worsening? The answer isn't a lack of money or knowledge. It's a political battle over ideology, resource allocation, and a fundamental disagreement on the humanity of the unhoused. This is a story of who, exactly, is blocking the real solutions. The crisis by the numbers, a housing catastrophe. The sheer scale of homelessness in the United States has moved beyond a social problem. It is an economic and moral catastrophe. The latest data from 2024 is unequivocal. The situation is not just bad, it is reaching unprecedented historical highs. This rapid, widespread increase demonstrates that the current political and policy structure is fundamentally broken. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, reported that the total number of people experiencing homelessness is the highest since reporting began in 2007, with roughly 70 out of every 10,000 Americans experiencing homelessness. For families with children, the increase is particularly brutal, with a 39% rise in family homelessness between 2023 and 2024. These aren't just statistics. These are families who, despite the promise of American prosperity, are being pushed out of the shelter system and onto the streets, often due to the simultaneous expiration of pandemic-era rental assistance programs and soaring housing costs. This financial pressure cooker proves that the primary driver of homelessness is a lack of affordable housing, not personal failing, a fact that is constantly debated and distorted in the political arena. Experts agree that the core structural issue is simple. For every 100 extremely low-income renter households, there are only approximately 35 affordable and available rental homes. This shortage of 7 million affordable homes across the country is the economic guillotine that political paralysis refuses to lift. The ideological divide, housing first versus treatment first. The most significant political and legislative blockade centers on the philosophical approach to providing aid, housing first versus the so-called treatment first or linear models. This is not just a policy debate. It is a profound ideological schism that paralyzes federal and local action. The housing first model is the current evidence-based federal policy championed by groups like the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, USIC. It operates on a simple, pragmatic principle. A person needs a safe, stable place to live before they can effectively address other challenges like addiction, mental health issues, or finding long-term employment. It provides permanent housing with no prerequisites, no sobriety requirements, no mandatory therapy, but provides voluntary, wraparound support services. The data shows this model works. Most notably, the highly successful reduction in veteran homelessness by over 55% since 2009 is largely attributed to the targeted, housing-first approach of the HUD VSH Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing Program. When the government commits resources and adopts the model, progress is undeniable. However, a strong political counter-movement, often emanating from conservative think tanks and local, right-leaning municipal governments, advocates for the treatment-first model. This perspective, increasingly gaining traction in states and cities, argues that services, treatment, and sobriety should be mandatory conditions for receiving stable housing. Proponents argue that simply providing a free house without addressing the root causes, often narrowly defined as individual behavioral issues like drug addiction or mental illness, is a waste of taxpayer money and fails to rehabilitate the individual. This is where the political blockade solidifies. By framing homelessness as a moral or behavioral failure rather than a structural failure of the housing market, opponents of housing first manage to justify the inadequate allocation of housing resources and instead prioritize punitive, short-term measures. They argue that housing first is too expensive, but studies have consistently shown that the cost of providing permanent supportive housing is often less than the cost of managing chronic homelessness through emergency services, jails, and emergency room visits. The political choice, therefore, becomes one between cost-effective compassion and ideological conditions. legislative gridlock and underfunding, the federal stranglehold. The federal government's role is crucial, and here the legislative gridlock is most apparent. The resources provided are not just insufficient, they are dwarfed by the need. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition reports that only approximately 1 in 4 eligible households actually receive federal housing assistance. Wait lists for Section 8 housing vouchers stretch for months, even years. This massive gap in the social safety net is a direct result of chronic underfunding by Congress. While the Biden-Harris administration's budget proposals often call for significant increases, including a desire to expand housing vouchers to an additional 20,000 households in a single year, these requests often face strong headwinds, stalled by political resistance to what is branded as big government spending or welfare expansion. The entire U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, USIC, the small agency tasked with coordinating the federal response, spent only a meager $4.37 million in fiscal year 2024, representing less than 0.0001% of the total federal budget. This is a clear signal of where homelessness ranks on the national political priority list. Furthermore, the federal tax code remains a political sacred cow that heavily benefits the wealthy over the poor. The cost of the home mortgage interest deduction, a massive federal subsidy for affluent homeowners, is exponentially higher than the total budget for all federal rental assistance programs combined. The political refusal to restructure tax incentives to prioritize affordable housing development for the poorest Americans is perhaps the most significant, though often least discussed, barrier to a real solution. The NIMBY effect and local political resistance. The political battle is fought just as fiercely at a local level, where the not in my backyard NIMBY phenomenon transforms affordable housing projects into political hot-button issues. Local zoning laws and city council decisions often serve as the most effective blockades. Restrictive single-family zoning in many affluent and suburban areas makes it virtually impossible to build the multifamily, high-density housing necessary to lower overall housing costs. These policies are often defended under guise of preserving neighborhood character, but their practical effect is to exclude low-income residents and people experiencing homelessness. The political pressure on local representatives from established, property-owning constituencies often outweighs the desperate need for affordable units. In response, many local governments, unable or unwilling to address the housing shortage, resort to punitive criminalization of homelessness. Ordinances that ban sleeping in public, prohibit panhandling, or restrict food sharing are not solutions. They are political displacement tools. These measures push the unhoused out of sight and into the criminal justice system, saddling individuals with fines and arrest records that create new barriers to housing and employment. This approach, while politically popular in some communities looking to clean up public spaces, is a costly and cruel diversion from the only proven solution: building more deeply affordable housing. The political cycle is clear. Refuse to fund housing, criminalize the ensuing encampments, and then claim the problem is unsolvable without more policing. The weaponization of the unhoused, a culture war. In the current political landscape, the homelessness crisis has been fully weaponized into a culture war issue, shifting the focus from structural solutions to political blame. A significant portion of the public discourse, often amplified by certain media and political figures, focuses on narratives that sensationalize mental illness and drug use among the unhoused, ignoring the fact that 2/3 of the homeless population do not suffer from chronic mental illness or addiction. By constantly portraying the unhoused as a monolithic group of dangerous, unmanageable individuals, politicians are able to effectively scare their constituencies away from supporting large-scale housing investment. The narrative becomes, we shouldn't reward bad behavior, or these are not people who can be helped, instead of we need a market correction to the cost of housing. This political framing is a calculated maneuver. It allows for the continued support of tax cuts and a small government philosophy, while deflecting the public's understandable concern about the visible crisis onto an abstract enemy, the failed liberal policies or the disruptive homeless, rather than the concrete political decisions that created the housing scarcity. This culture war effectively blocks the necessary bipartisan consensus that would allow for the massive, coordinated federal investment required to tackle a problem of this national scale. What the political blockade is rejecting The frustrating reality is that the political world knows what is needed. The solutions are not mysterious. They are simply being rejected for ideological and electoral reasons. The proven path forward is one that involves radical scaling up of policies that have demonstrated success. 1. A massive, sustained investment in federal rental assistance and a low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC, to create millions of new, deeply affordable units. 2. The universal adoption and funding of the Housing First model, accompanied by voluntary, robust, and permanent supportive services for individuals with complex needs. 3. Federal intervention to eliminate restrictive local zoning laws, NIMBYism, that block affordable housing construction. 4. A dedicated focus on prevention, including eviction defense programs and guaranteed assistance for vulnerable populations aging out of foster care or exiting the criminal justice system. The political battle over homelessness is not a battle of capability. It is a battle of will. It is a conflict between the demonstrable evidence that stable housing is the foundation of human success and the deep-seated political ideologies that prioritize punitive measures, individual blame, and tax cuts for the wealthy over the basic human right to shelter. Until the political system is forced to prioritize human lives over ideological purity, the crisis will continue to worsen, and America's unhoused population will remain the most visible casualties of profound political failure. The policy roadblocks, bureaucracy, and systemic racism. Even when funding is allocated, bureaucratic inertia, and a failure to confront systemic inequalities create additional political roadblocks. The siloing of federal agencies. A significant barrier to an integrated solution is the siloed nature of federal policy and funding. Programs for homelessness, mental health, substance abuse, veteran affairs, and housing are administered by separate, often non-collaborative, departments like HUD, HHS, Health and Human Services, and the VA. The lack of a unified, politically mandated strategy for interagency cooperation means that a homeless individual with a co-occurring disorder must navigate a fragmented, bureaucratic maze to access comprehensive care. For example, a person may qualify for a HUD housing voucher, but struggle to access the necessary mental health care due to state-level Medicaid restrictions or a lack of coordination between the housing provider and the local community mental health center. Political mandates often emphasize departmental performance targets rather than holistic client outcomes, creating a system where different agencies are inadvertently working at cross-purposes. The result is inefficiency and a failure to deliver the wraparound services essential for long-term stability. The shadow of systemic racism, the disproportionate impact of homelessness on minority groups, reveals a political failure to address the systemic causes tied to race. According to statistical data, Black, Hispanic/Latinx, and indigenous populations experience homelessness at rates far exceeding their representation in the general U.S. population. Black individuals, who account for roughly 13% of the U.S. population, make up approximately 32% of the homeless population. Similarly, American Indian, Alaska Native, and indigenous populations suffer a particularly high rate, with approximately 83 out of every 10,000 people experiencing homelessness. This disparity is a direct consequence of historical and ongoing policy choices. Discriminatory lending practices, redlining, unequal access to quality education and employment, and mass incarceration. For many political actors, addressing homelessness means confronting these deeply embedded issues, which requires a difficult and often politically charged reckoning with structural racism. When proposals for housing and services fail to explicitly target and correct these racial inequities, often because of political pushback against race-conscious policies, they fail to reach the populations most in need, perpetuating the crisis within these communities. The political refusal to legislate on a scale commensurate with the historical harm inflicted by decades of discriminatory policies remains a major obstruction. The path forward. The political battle over American homelessness is not a dispute over whether the problem is serious. Both sides acknowledge the crisis. It is a battle over philosophy, funding, and local control. The real solutions are blocked not by a lack of knowledge, but by a lack of sustained, bipartisan, and courageous political will. Breaking this logjam requires political actors to move beyond the binary debate of housing first versus treatment first and embrace a hybrid model that fully funds both. Housing first with immediate and mandated access to voluntary, comprehensive services. It requires a federal government willing to make a financial commitment to affordable housing at a scale not seen since the Great Depression, paired with local governments willing to overcome NIMBY pressure and relax exclusionary zoning.